I'm Barbara Rossner, founding editor of the New Bedford Light, the free nonprofit, nonpartisan digital news outlet based here in our city of New Bedford. We recently published an extraordinary piece of journalism that went really deep inside the lives and the struggles of New Bedford's immigrant workers, many of whom have toiled through the pandemic in frontline jobs, but without the pandemic relief that so many of us have relied on to get through. Today, the Light republished the story in Spanish, thanks to a translation provided to us by El País, the global news outlet based in Madrid. Our partner in this work is the Marshall Project, one of the nation's, if not the nation's, premier investigative digital nonprofit news outlets. That was founded in 2014 by Bill Keller, former editor of the New York Times. And we have with us the two Marshall Project reporters who authored this international story, national and international story. And they are going to speak with us about how they came to land in New Bedford and what they learned here and why their findings are so important for us to understand. Moderating the chat is New Bedford Light columnist Jack Spillane.
How did you settle on New Bedford as the place to illustrate the fact that undocumented essential workers have been shut out of so much of this COVID relief money?
We were looking for a location that had a rich immigrant history where we could look at the situation, particularly of people who were in the food industry and who were in some kind of institutional or factory situation. And really New Bedford represents, the workforce in New Bedford represents so much of the American workforce that kept going during the pandemic, that they were forced to keep going in large part because of the lack of support that they were getting from the federal government. Also, I have to say that early on in the process, when we were trying to figure this out, we saw that there was the New Bedford Light. And one of the things that the Marshall Project really likes to do is partner with organizations that do the same kind of work that we do on a national basis, but that are doing it at the local level, bringing fact-finding, nonpartisan reporting, nonprofit reporting down to the community level. So we saw this, we were hoping that this partnership would be fruitful, and it really has been.
Yeah. In a community where there often are not the resources to do this kind of reporting, I think that people are just so grateful to have it and to bring to life these stories of a community that, even though it's approaching 20% of the New Bedford population, is largely invisible to many of the city's residents. So thank you so much. When you came to the city at first, how did you gain the trust of the immigrant community? Because they are undocumented, they are often closed to much of the outside world. How did you gain their trust?
Ariel, you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Well, a lot of what we are looking to do at the Marshall Project, and what my job is at the Marshall Project, is something called engagement journalism. And it's a new sort of form of thinking about journalism that looks not only to kind of go into a community to report about them, but actually to collaboratively go through the reporting process with a community and to kind of explore different ways and different ways it can look like for a community to actually have a voice within the reporting process and not just be talked about, but be talked with. So that was a little bit of our approach, I think, when we were speaking with the immigrant community. The immigrant community in New Bedford is an incredibly diverse community. You know, I was blown away by not only kind of the diversity of different countries that are represented, the diversity of the history, this long history of immigrant labor in the city, but also, you know, specifically within the Central American community, the diversity of languages. Many of the folks that we were talking to, Spanish was not their first language. Many of their first languages was Quiche, were indigenous dialects. So with that in mind, we went into this community not only kind of looking at how we could tell their story, but looking at ways that the community itself was telling its own story. And that led us to a lot of, I think, what we'll get into later in this conversation, but ways in which the community was communicating with each other about what the experience was like to, in many cases, not have any work from one day to the next, or to go to work as essential workers, the ways that they were communicating with one another and supporting one another in order to survive. And so that was why in the piece, we have our piece, but we also brought in elements like a WhatsApp group that there were, over 200 community members that were communicating back and forth, asking and answering one another's questions about the lockdown, about how to, cure COVID cases, getting information, Facebook, ways that people, from one day to the next had to start new businesses, right? Selling food from their homes, finding ways to survive. So we tried to incorporate that into our process and also into the final piece.
I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that indigenous community who are well known to us in New Bedford as the Maya Quiche, and why they have some specific unique challenges in accessing government programs or even the police just integrating into whatever programs are available.
Well, I can speak to that a little bit as one who, much earlier in my career, I actually covered the Civil War in Guatemala. And so the conditions that many of the immigrants who now live in New Bedford are fleeing, that violence and the there's a really racist, anti-indigenous society in Guatemala, and it's been there for many, many years. I can tell you that. So one of the characteristics of this population is that many of them are asylum seekers, or they've come across the border in conditions where they really can't go home. They've come here for a new life because the old one just became too dangerous. So that's one of the characteristics, but many of them, and particularly the immigrants we spoke with, come from the highlands of Guatemala, where, as Ariel said, Spanish is not their first language. They speak Mam, they speak Maya Quiche. So just and many of the processes in immigration and also in applying for federal benefits, you have to have some kind of basic command of English for starters, but you also need to have a basic command of technology and, how to use a website and what is the IRS. And, this is knowledge that is not easily available to some of these folks, even though if you talk to anyone in the factories where, the seafood packing houses where they work, they're just incredibly skilled workers. There's no lack of ability there. It's just the language barrier and some of the cultural barriers that sometimes make it difficult for them.
I wonder, Julie, for some of our listeners who haven't read the story yet, if you can capsulize a little bit of why these immigrant workers are not eligible for the COVID relief packages that passed early on in the Biden administration and before.
A lot of the immigrants in the workforce, the packing workforce and the seafood workforce in New Bedford are either have no immigration status, they're out of immigration status, or many of them are actually in a legal process of seeking asylum. But those processes, those court cases are just hugely backed up. And they end up being in an ambiguous situation in terms of whether they have legal work authorization or not. So you have people that they're at a disadvantage with respect to the immigration system, and one of the implications of that is that they don't have social security numbers. And in our system, in our immigration system and in our federal system, and having a social security number, the immigrants talk about it. It's the difference between yo tengo un social, I have a social, or no tengo social. This is a clear-cut distinction in the community that everyone understands. And most of the benefits, well, first of all, they're not eligible across the board for any unemployment, either federal or state, no unemployment insurance. And so this obviously had an enormous impact because you couldn't stay home. There just was not the option to stay home. People without Social Security numbers are not eligible for the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is something that is very beneficial to many low-income families. And over the course of the pandemic, there were a series of restrictions on how much of the federal direct aid that was related to COVID relief was available to people that did not have Social Security numbers. I think I should clarify here something very, very important for people in New Bedford to understand, which is that your seafood workers and many people who are working in plants, first of all, they are filing their taxes. They are paid with a paycheck. Their taxes are subject to standard deductions. So they are paying taxes and they are filing taxes. The IRS makes tax paying available to and required really for immigrants who don't have Social Security numbers by providing a different number that they can use to pay and file their taxes. So all this time, these folks were working hard because they couldn't get unemployment insurance, and they were not eligible for many forms of COVID relief, yet they are paying their taxes just like everybody else. And many of their kids are US citizens. So this is the kind of constellation that you have here of these workers. They're paying their taxes, they are working hard, and many of their kids are US citizen children.
And some might ask, how are they working in the seafood houses if they don't have a Social Security number? And many don't know that they work through these temporary agencies, right, who maybe are not as religious about getting valid Social Security numbers. And so that's the way they're working.
You said it exactly right. You used a very judicious term there, not as religious. This is the entire way. I mean, Jack, I'm sure you've seen it. This is the way the waterfront operates, right?
Yes.
And I'll just add, this is also, when we're talking about these workers, this is also our entire food system. We can be talking about folks working in the fish industry, people working in the poultry industry. When we're talking about these issues of labor, what we're really talking about, right, is how food arrived on all of our tables during this crisis. So, I think this is a story that affects, we're not only talking about the labor conditions of this specific community, but we're talking about an issue that anyone who eats food in this country is deeply connected to. And, this term of essential worker kind of came out of the pandemic, was, a federal term that was given to people so their industry could continue to function, specifically people working in the food industry. So I think that, for so many reasons, the pandemic just became this time where all of these things were deeply revealed. Who are the workers that are essential to the function of this country? And what did it mean for them? And what does it mean for them not to have access to any of these federal protections?
Yeah, Ariel, it reminds me a little bit of the stories we read in the beginning of the pandemic of the meatpacking workers who, and I know from my own reporting, many of them are also undocumented immigrants, and they were as much as forced to go to work even when they were sick. They were the definition of essential workers. Many of them got sick in these close on plants where they work, which is similar to the seafood houses. So it really is just astonishing that these essential workers were not provided these benefits.
And I think
Right.
it's worth, reiterating a point that Ariel just made. I didn't say they were essential. Ariel didn't say that. The Department of Homeland Security issued guidelines at the beginning of the pandemic as to who is an essential worker. And so the workers, the workers who are packing seafood in New Bedford are essential workers, not because I said so, but because the Department of Homeland Security said so. It's an official denomination that has to do with whether or not you are actually obliged to continue working, even though the risks of the pandemic risks are incredibly high.
And I think just one thing to add on to that we get into a little bit in the piece is, despite, being excluded from this kind of federal aid, one of the things that felt so astonishing and important to highlight as we were talking to folks in New Bedford is that, this idea of a network, a social safety net, is this term that we all used, but a network of how does a community stay afloat, in times like this? And one of the things that became very clear, there's a saying in Spanish that says, solo el pueblo salva el pueblo. Only the community saves the community. And that is, what we were finding as we were talking to people, despite not having access to, these federal programs. Oftentimes, a safety net for people looked like getting, borrowing money from a family member. It looked like, as I mentioned in the beginning, one day to the next saying, okay, well, I don't have access to my job, so what is it that I'm going to do? A lot of people started selling food and, sharing it within the community. A lot of people, we talked to one person who was a subsistence farmer in his country of origin, and that was what he knew how to do. He knew how to grow vegetables. So he found a plot of land on the outskirts of town and started growing vegetables and selling them in town. So I think it's important, as we're talking about asylum seekers, people who have had to overcome, grave difficulty in their lives. This was not the first crisis that this community was facing. And in many ways, they had tools to survive, which is ultimately what they leaned on for support in that time. And I do also just want to mention the community was there for one another. We talked to people who, took care of one another's children while some people went to work, some person stayed home with the kids. Like, people figured out ways to, to survive, to continue working, to continue putting food on the table. But there also are some amazing organizations in New Bedford that we were lucky enough to connect with. The Center for Economic Development is one of them. Speaking of taxes and this thing that can seem sort of far off when we're talking about situations where people are trying to put food on their table, people like tax preparers, the folks who are helping people navigate these extremely complicated systems. When we're speaking about who's essential in our society, it's like these people became kind of the connectors in this time of darkness. So I just wanted to put that out there, that there really are some amazing community organizations in New Bedford that we were very impressed talking with and just hearing about all the ways that they sprung into action when crisis struck.
Ariel, you're getting to all my questions for later in the program and some of your answers. So I'll think of some new questions as I go along. But that's great. It really is important to describe just how much these workers are and these immigrants are the definition of the American self-sufficiency story. They invent ways to take care of themselves when the social safety network is not there. I want to add, either Julie or Ariel answer this. Now that Build Back Better has failed, is there any chance that the provision that would have provided essential immigrant workers relief could be passed on its own or as part of a smaller program, or is it dead now?
It's a little hard to tell if it's where it stands. This entire package at $1.75 trillion, as you know, failed basically because of the vote of one senator, which was Joe Manchin of West Virginia, right before the Christmas holiday. And there are just a lot of negotiations going on in Washington to see what the administration on the White House is definitely going to move forward on many elements of this bill. The question is, what are they going to be? So one of the programs that the workers in New Bedford were actually eligible for was the child tax credit. Now, this is, I mean, anyone who's got a family and pays taxes who's on this Zoom will, part of this town hall will be probably familiar with the child tax credit, and people who pay taxes with what's called an independent taxpayer number, an ITIN, are eligible for the child tax credit. And Joe Biden at the beginning of last year expanded the child tax credit so that it actually reached out to the lowest income families, which it had not done before. And he made it available to be paid out in these advance payments so that families who had filed their taxes and been, kept up to date with their taxes, with their taxpayer numbers, started receiving in August of last year $300 or $250 in their bank accounts for if they had American citizen children. Now, I want to stress that we're talking, these are benefits that are going to children who are American citizens. And so that provision to continue expanding the child tax credit was in Build Back Better. Joe Manchin has said that he wants to add some work requirements to that, but this is just an incredibly popular benefit within the Democratic Party and within the American public at large, and particularly, as it turns out, in West Virginia, where Senator Manchin has been facing people coming to town halls and complaining about his position on the child tax credit throughout the recess that has just taken place. So there are negotiations underway right now about including the child tax credit in an eventual Build Back Better bill. And I mention this because, this is something that had a hugely positive impact in the midst of this scenario of exclusion for the seafood packing workers and other workers in New Bedford from federal COVID relief. The one exception to that were these payments that landed, people could pay their rent. This was putting food on the table. This is not frivolous spending. This was being able to pay for your Wi-Fi connection, not because you want to listen to Spotify, but because your kids need it to be able to go to school these days. And so folks in New Bedford, this is important, this child tax credit. You might, it would be a good thing to get, have your Congress people be aware that this is an important issue for the working community in New Bedford. There are also, I'll just quickly mention, there are other more ambitious immigration focused provisions in Build Back Better, and it's a little unclear what's going to happen with them, but the immigrant advocacy community across the country is really still very fired up to get something to happen. Joe Biden made a lot of promises to the immigrant communities across the country, and coming up with nothing, I don't think will be at all good for him as we go into this year of midterm elections. So I don't know, it's not dead. It's still alive in Washington. And I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to see what is going to be, what is going to come out of this.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see what Congressman Keating has to say. He doesn't talk about undocumented immigrants that often. He's the congressman from the 9th District representing New Bedford. Ariel, these stories about the essential nature of these workers who work in our food supply, why are they so invisible in the American media? Do you have any theories as to why we just don't read these stories that often about what integral roles they play in both our economy and our food supply?
I mean, I think that that's a fantastic question. for us as journalists to be asking ourselves and sort of our community, you know, in the media. I think that you highlighted a really important point, as did Julia, you know, talking about these tax provisions, is that when we are talking about tax issues, when we are talking about issues of food justice, when we're talking about labor issues, even when we're talking about education issues, these are all immigrant issues. And I think that that is, you know, something that in many ways the pandemic has revealed to us. I think oftentimes people think of immigration as being something that, you know, is connected to border policy and the ways in which people are kind of coming and going from this country, which of course is true. But, you know, once again, the pandemic has taken back this veil of us to be able to really see the interconnectedness of all of this. Immigrants are a part of every community in this country. And so when we're talking about things like who has access, like Julia mentioned, to Wi-Fi, you know, who is able to pay for Wi-Fi for their children to go to school, that's an immigrant issue, because immigrants are part of our communities, and immigrants and their children, who oftentimes are US citizens, you know, are having to access these services. So I think that that's a really important issue, right? When we're talking about labor, when we're talking about who's doing the work in this country, who is upholding the entire economy, that's an immigration issue. So I think that, yeah, this is a really important moment to see kind of the interconnectedness, even when we're talking about issues of racial justice. These are issues that are deeply connected to the immigrant community and just who has access, you know, to the basics of survival in our society. So, yeah, I think that the question of the media and how people are being represented is a really important one for us all to be asking, considering what you mentioned about the growing population, even you know, the very simple means of accessibility around language. What kind of news and information are people able to access? Do people feel reflected? You know, do people see their stories reflected? I think there's often deep distrust, right, with the media because of the ways that people have seen themselves represented, have seen their stories represented, and often boiled down to very kind of like specific issues like kind of immigration legislation and all of that. I think that it's important every time we're talking about any issue that's prevalent in our communities, it's always an immigrant issue, and it's always tied to the issue that immigrant communities are facing. So I think that they should be a part of every story that we're writing.
I know sometimes local media are challenged by the language, and they're also they're dealing with a community that is fearful because they don't know if police will, you know, turn them in. We have a local sheriff here who is running a detention center. People are fearful. I wanted to ask about the fire that you.
I just want to emphasize that point, Jack. Yeah. I mean, we're talking about families where you have an undocumented parent. That person may be married to an American citizen or to a person who does have legal status. There may be one child who is also undocumented, or may have, you know, may have DACA, may have some kind of temporary status. You'll have three or four kids who were born in the United States. So, because these folks have been here out of status now for many years, so they've created their families. But at the heart of that is a person who doesn't have a firm status to be in the United States, and really, and particularly under the last administration of President Trump, who his policy was that anyone who was out of status could be deported at any time. You know, there were 4 years there where it was extremely high risk for your immigrant community, and particularly in Massachusetts, where, for example, they still can't get a driver's license. And so just, you know, driving to work is a high risk, a high risk activity. And then came the pandemic, where you can't afford, if you're an undocumented person, you can't get unemployment insurance and any kind of other, you're excluded from many other forms of assistance. So you really can't afford to lose your job. So that there were those two levels of fear now that I think are operating. Perhaps the enforcement picture is not quite as immediately intense as it was under President Trump, but it's still a reality for these undocumented people. And that, I think, also is one of the reasons why we don't read about them enough, because why would they come forward? The country's not welcoming them. The country is not providing solid ground for them to stand on.
One of the little known provisions of Build Back Better was that people who have been here for 10 years would be granted a status to allow them to work with a
Right.
social security number. I thought that was very interesting. I wanted to return to the entree to your story, which was this big fire we had in New Bedford last year. 2 tenement buildings, very tightly packed, many immigrants living in them, went up in flames one winter night. Can you talk about why you chose that as your entrance to the story?
We just felt that the fire really just kind of revealed all of the dynamics of vulnerability of these workers and these immigrants during the pandemic. Since they didn't have forms of relief, they were, forced in many cases to sort of move together into more crowded circumstances. The kids were working at home, so that we're going to school at home, so that made even, there was even more crowding. Just the basic things of putting food on the table just became incredibly difficult. And the reason that part of the reason this fire was so destructive is that in at least one of the buildings, the fire alarms had been deactivated or had expired years ago. The building was so crowded that the emergency exit was blocked with furniture and desks, and 2 people died in that fire. It was really just because of the incredibly fast work of the firefighters in New Bedford that it wasn't more of a catastrophe, I think. But it in addition to being a drama and so vivid and painful for the people themselves, so that they were really, it was so, quite a number of the people that we ended up interviewing were the U.S. citizen kids of these families. And to hear these kids talk about what it's like to, you walk out of your bedroom, your mom is screaming, and she's dragging you out into the hallway, and everything you own, your sneakers, your video game, the few things that you as a child have acquired in the United States is just gone. To hear the kids talk about that was just very moving and powerful. And so, part of what we want to do here is really bring the emotion and the sense of humanity of these folks to the readers, and to the, including the readers of the New Bedford Light, which I hope we succeeded in doing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's important, we're now 2 years plus into this pandemic. So this is not only a story of, crisis has hit a community and what do they do? This is a story of how, all of these things that we're talking about, lack of aid, people not having access to basic needs like internet, things that will allow them to get an education. How have all of these things crystallized now, for these workers into these 2 years? And we just felt like that fire kind of showed us, a view into that the pandemic and the disaster, that is the pandemic, really, the fire continues to rage, for lack of a better metaphor, for a lot of people. The story of the pandemic is not over, and the story of the ways that the, injustices that people might have faced pre-pandemic have just become cemented in people's lives. And so this is a situation, once again, where people once again have to begin anew. begin their lives anew, just like how they did when they arrived to this country, just like how many had to do completely readjust, once COVID hit, and now these fires.
And speaking
And
with the Guatemalan community, I've had people express a lot of mistrust around that fire in terms of the two people who died, the ability to rescue them, the expired fire alarms, the conditions of the alley where it's probably a code violation. We always have terrible conditions in the low-income tenement neighborhoods of New Bedford, but those neighborhoods are largely undocumented. Is there anything that you reported on that made you feel that the conditions of these buildings is related to who rents in them?
Only in the sense that, as you may have experienced, the rents in New Bedford have, during the pandemic, the cost of housing has just gone through the roof, and so the only thing I would say is that, folks ended up in those buildings and living in pretty crowded conditions because that's what they could afford on the salaries that they're making and the wages that they're making as seafood workers down on the waterfront. And what we saw in New Bedford is there are a lot of buildings like that. And so this is not just a problem that affects Guatemalan immigrant workers. This should be a matter of concern to all New Bedford residents who live in those, the whole city is those clapboard-sided apartment buildings, the 3-story, 4-story apartment buildings. And, the possibility of fire is present for, the entire working community that lives in those buildings. So I would say that, it was particularly severe problem for this group of seafood workers and Guatemalan workers who were living in those particular 2 buildings, but it's not limited to them at all. The risks of fire at this point, at this late stage in the pandemic in New Bedford.
We have a question come in from Rebecca Bonds about how unique or widely shared is the Guatemalan experience in New Bedford. Is each immigrant community isolated or engaged with other immigrant communities? And I will add to that, the undocumented workers in New Bedford are not just the Guatemalans, there are other immigrant groups too. Did you encounter much of that and distinctions between these various groups?
Ariel, you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think that maybe Jack, you can probably speak to the sort of diversity of immigrants and the history, right? Because I know that we're talking about the history of immigration and immigration labor in the city it goes on and on for generations. But we did speak to people who were from Cape Verde. We spoke to people, Portuguese people. When we're talking about Guatemalans, that's not the only country that's represented. I spoke to people from Mexico. We spoke to people from El Salvador. And to the question of, is it limited is the experience, particular in New Bedford? I think that the reason, one of the reasons that we came to New Bedford was because we were looking to kind of represent an experience that I think, I can say happens in a lot of states in the country, which is immigrant communities who come and who become a vital part of a workforce in many different industries. We see this in cities, we see it in rural places in the country. So I think that when we're talking about the challenges that people face around language, around access, and around lack of aid, it's something that people experience throughout the country and continue to experience who lack status.
One thing that struck me was when you described the workers working in the seafood houses at the beginning of the pandemic, you described how they were afraid not to go to work. They were afraid, even if they were sick, to report to their bosses that they were sick. Were you able to talk to any of the bosses in the seafood houses, the owners? You have to assume that they know that some of their workers are undocumented, even though they've been hired by a temp agency. So how is it that you have this climate of fear among the workers that they dare not complain or not come to work?
Well, I made many weeks of effort to try and talk to people, to owners of the, and CEOs and the leading people in the packing houses. And nobody wanted to talk to me about the status of the workforce.
I've been there.
Yeah. It's a system. I couldn't get anyone who made an estimate for me of how many, what percentage of the seafood workforce in New Bedford is out of status, is undocumented. But I have to think it's maybe 1 in 3. I mean, this is a big part of your workforce down on the waterfront, and maybe on the boats as well. So that's a secret that, what they in Spanish they call un secreto a voces. This is like the best, a secret that everybody knows. And why would I can understand why a plant owner would not really want to go there to talk about this.
And yet they employ these people.
Yeah. I mean, particularly during the pandemic, it wasn't easy to get people to continue to come to work. And we did hear from the workers that, many of the packing houses really did take important measures to try and make it safer for people. And, I'm not suggesting that didn't happen. But the bottom line is that the folks had to go to work because they couldn't stay home. No matter how, if they had somebody who was sick at home, or even if they weren't feeling totally well, they had to go to work because there was no unemployment insurance. There were, most of these federal benefits just were not available to them.
And as Ariel said, they've developed this network to support each other and to start these cottage businesses, whether it's food or whatever, almost to make up for what they don't get from the government or their employer.
I will say that, the workers that we spoke to were very conscientious, they were very aware of what they needed to do to protect themselves and keep themselves healthy. There I didn't hear any vaccine resistance. There was a little bit at the beginning, I think, when we were all a little uncertain about how these vaccines were going to work. But, by the time we finished our story, most of our people that we spoke with had been vaccinated, and they were, eager to protect themselves. So I wouldn't say that they were being reckless. I'm saying I would say that they were doing what they had to do to keep their families fed and to be able to pay the rent in a situation where their wages are basically their only income. One of the I'll just mention this, but we did a calculation for this story. We went to an organization called ITEP, which is a nonpartisan think tank that does tax analysis. And we asked them to make a calculation for us, the difference in income over the 2 years of the pandemic between a family, a seafood working family with an undocumented breadwinner who was not eligible for COVID relief or unemployment insurance. Between that family, now we're talking about a 4-person family with 2 American citizen kids, and an American family where everybody is eligible for all of the relief and for unemployment insurance. And the difference in less than 2 years in income was $34,000 between the 2 families. So $34,000 is more than many of your seafood workers make in a year. And so this was a big hit that these families took because they could not access a lot of this federal aid.
You keep getting to my questions later, but
Oh.
that's fine. That was $34,000 for 8 weeks of a couple, both laid off for 8 weeks. That what they lost because they were
Right.
not eligible for these benefits.
Right. And you know, really, if you had a family where you had two American citizen parent taxpayers who were eligible for unemployment insurance, they might have taken between the two of them much more than 8 weeks off. You know, one of the parents might have been, you know, taken unemployment insurance for the entire time, and that they were eligible. And so this was in many ways a conservative estimate of the difference in income between a seafood worker family that did not have a social security number and a family with two parents who did have social security numbers. And again, both of the kids in those families, in the estimate that we did, both kids were US citizens. These are American kids. Yeah. Sorry.
Ariel?
I was just going to sort of highlight that what Julia's talking about is like, we're really talking about the children, you know, and I think that that's something that we're grappling with as we're thinking about these complex kind of tax issues and even this stuff around immigration reform. Are children who are not able to receive benefits, who are, you know, missing out on and that can be, you know, when we look at the ripple effects of this, it's huge. It's access to education, it's access to food, because of their parents' status. So this is a huge issue, right, that we're grappling with when we're talking about these kind of details of it. Is how are kids basically on some form being discriminated against because of their parents' status? You know, how are they, what is the trickle down effects of these in kind of the larger bedrock of our society and to people who are US citizens, right?
I wanted to talk about YR, this 7th grader who chose not to tell his classmates why he was out for a week after he was burnt out of the fire. That story seems so illustrative to me of the stress many of these undocumented workers and their children, and I assume YR is an American citizen, and just the stress that he's in, that he can't tell his classmates why he disappeared for a week.
Just this was just a remarkable guy. I mean, you know, he was in 7th grade when this happened, and you know, he just it's such a kind of a 7th grade thing, right? You know, his house burned down. He lost everything that he owned. And yet his feeling was, you know, I don't want to talk about this with my friends because they're going to feel sorry for me. And I just want to hang out with my friends. And his, you know, and this was a situation where his mom is a seafood worker, and she, the day after the fire, got up and went back to work, you know, so that she could be sure that they could still have income coming in, because now they have to look for a new place to live. They have to replace their you know, they have nothing. And I, you know, I have continued to stay in touch with this young man. He's now in 8th grade, and he's really a remarkable student. There's a program, I think it's called the Century 21 program or something. There's an after-school program in the New Bedford schools where you learn extra history, and you go, you know, there's all kinds of sort of, you know, extra reading and about American history and the history of New Bedford, and this guy, you know, he just like his family is, you know, bounced right back. Okay, I lost everything I own. I'm going to go back to school, and I'm going to make it up, and I'm going to hang with my friends, and I'm going to, you know, somehow make this work. I mean, the resilience of these kids is just amazing. But New Bedford, you know, the community should be giving them, they're American citizens. They're not going anywhere. They're part of our community. And yet they're, you know, they're paying the price for an immigration system that is, you know, not providing solid ground for their parents.
It's a completely different portrait. The nobility in this kid and some of the parents and the workers, it's a completely different portrait than you often get of undocumented immigrants in the national media. We have a question from Chuck Smiler asking us to address the healthcare access and vaccine equity during the pandemic. I know that there are some special challenges with the undocumented immigrants and feeling safe going to the hospital. Did you encounter any challenging stories about getting care and vaccine access, et cetera, during the pandemic? I know New Bedford did have a lot of programs.
One of the things that I was struck by, we spent a lot of our days reporting in New Bedford, actually accompanying some of the outreach workers who were working to sort of promote and talk to community members about the vaccine. There were some really interesting programs that actually employed community members, Quiche speaking folks, some of the people in our story, to talk with other community members about this vaccine. And I think it's such a good model because you just see the way that people, interact with someone who speaks their own language, who comes from, the town that they come from in Guatemala, talking about a vaccine versus, a healthcare industry that, as you mentioned, is often inaccessible, feeling very foreign and not necessarily a place where people feel reflected or safe. So that was actually, I think, a real highlight that I saw in the community was the ways in which, this idea of employing the community members themselves to go out and inform the community about what this vaccine is was a huge success. But Julia, I don't know if you have anything to add on that.
Well, one of the kind of, I would say, overhangs from the Trump administration under President Trump, he published a series of regulations that made it so that legal immigrants, these are people who are in the country legally with permanent residency, even if they accessed federal programs and particularly federal health programs, that could disqualify them from going on to become American citizens. This was a series of rules and regulations having to do with something called public charge. The intent is that immigrants should not become public charges on their way to citizenship. So the Biden administration has substantially reversed a lot of those rules and provisions, but there was this fear in the immigrant community, and that extended well beyond the people who are undocumented. That affected people who were here with total, their legal status totally in order. There was a kind of a reluctance. If I come forward and take some benefit, particularly a health benefit, is this going to come back to haunt me later on when I want to become a legal resident or even a U.S. citizen? So that was, I think, a hurdle that had to be overcome, in addition to whatever, kind of fears and I mean, this community, particularly the community from Guatemala, they come from a situation at home where there's no public health clinic, there's no hospital. You have to really kind of make it on your own in all but the most dire circumstances. And so, at the beginning, I think there was a lot of worry and fear and what is this vaccine and should I give it to my child, and maybe amplified a little bit by some of the cultural beliefs that people brought. But I was kind of surprised that, what Ariel is saying, once New Bedford got mobilized to really reach out to people, they were responsive, and they, the folks that we spoke to were ready to be vaccinated and ready to do what they needed to do to keep the community safe.
And I just want to add one detail is that, when we're talking about health and immigrant communities, and especially, when we're talking about why people have such dire financial needs and have to continue working. We're talking about a situation that extends far beyond, the immediate community. Many folks that we spoke to were mothers who were sending provisions home to sick relatives. So these are kind of statistics and data that we're never really going to know on a large national level, is what was the impact of folks losing their jobs and not being able to pay vital medical bills, maybe in their home countries that they had been supporting, with their work in the United States. So I think that the footprint of this, the footprint of the economic need and what it meant in terms of health of this community, we can say for sure had an impact not only in the immigrant community in New Bedford, but to their home community in Guatemala.
As we begin to wrap up here, I want to go back to Ariel, when you were talking about the networking and people making do by getting odd jobs, making food and selling it, doubling up on living accommodations. We know that the federal government did not step up for these immigrants, but what about locally? The city of New Bedford, the employers, the nonprofit agencies, how did they do during the pandemic for them?
Well, we spoke to, there were on not only in New Bedford, but in lots of cities and, in rural communities too around the country, there were local efforts to get kind of versions of a stimulus check to undocumented families. Those were often sustained by small organizations, like some of the organizations in New Bedford were able to get and redistribute cash and checks to families, people that they were in contact with. I believe there was some statewide money that was given that was also kind of distributed through organizations that people were able to access. But it was sort of a word of mouth type of thing. This wasn't, it wasn't like every single family who needed money was able to access it. But yeah, I think that we can definitely say, again, not only in New Bedford, but throughout the country, that it was those sort of localized redistribution efforts to get people like cash that they really needed in order to provide food and pay rent that was able to sustain folks. And it's definitely worth elevating those efforts and the importance of them.
Yeah, I would just say shout out to the CEDC, shout out to Helena da Silva Hughes, who did huge work, to the Movimiento Cosecha, to the Centro de Trabajadores. There were some organizations that really stepped up, particularly in New Bedford. And I'm sure there's a much longer list than that, but those organizations really made the difference. They saved lives. And
I'll name the names here. Corinne Williams of the Community Economic Development Center, Helena Hughes of the Immigrant Assistance Center, Adrian Ventura of Centro Comunitario de Trabajadores. Have I forgotten one?
Movimiento Cosecha would be Rolando. I can't remember.
Rolando Oliva.
Right.
Oliva.
Sorry.
Yeah, yes.
Sorry, Rolando.
Yes. I just want to thank you for doing this project. This partnership is just, I think, the definition of what the new journalism and community journalism should be. I've been here for 22 years in New Bedford, and for so long we've wanted to do these kinds of stories and haven't had the resources. And to see you guys come here and do this and bring back the veil and let us know about this immigrant community a little bit more. It's just been wonderful. And I just hope a lot of people will read it and appreciate your work. I am going to give the bios that I should have given at the beginning because I apologize. I didn't realize I had to do that. Julie Preston. We're talking about both national reporters here from the Marshall Project. Julie Preston is an American journalist and contributing writer for Marshall. She was a foreign and national correspondent and editor for the New York Times for 21 years. Ariel Goodman is an engagement fellow at the Marshall Project. She is bilingual, works in multiple mediums, and centers her work around community media, collaborative journalism, engagement to uplift voices and stories of those most affected by injustice. Here. And I want to mention Denise Pumagual, who did that translation for us tonight. I worked with Denise at the Standard Times. Have known her for a long time, and you just did a great job, Denise. Take it away, Bobby.
Thank you guys so much, Julia, Ariel, Denise, and Jack. And just to echo what Jack said, wow, I feel informed and inspired and disturbed after this past hour, and that's what good journalism does. And we're just so grateful to you guys for doing this work. It is hard work. And it is so, so important. So thank you for sharing it with us, and let's do more.
Okay.
Thank you all so much for having us. It's such an honor, and it was such an honor to also get to know your community in New Bedford. It's an incredibly interesting community with such an interesting and diverse history.
Yeah, it's an amazing place. This was the New Bedford Light's first bilingual effort, and we hope the first of many more as we strive to connect with the whole of this amazing city. You can read or reread the story, Essential But Excluded. I've read it a number of times. I'm going to go back and read it again. You can read it on our website in both English and Spanish as of today at newbedfordlight.org. We have lots of other interesting content there too, so check it out and let us know how we're doing. And if you have suggestions for things that we should be covering, please let us know. You can email me directly at editor@newbedfordlight.org. And to everybody listening, thank you so much for joining us, and the chat will be back soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go Light. Good
Thank
luck
you.
with your work.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
good. Really good.